Can I make its volume higher? No, that's the highest.
Let me check my audio.
Is Ben coming over? See that he's disappeared from there. Well,
Not sure.
you don't know.
No, because I'm in my apartment now, so I don't know if he's coming to the common room or something.
So you're at home, right?
Yes.
It's just us. Wow.
Maybe.
Oh, okay. So Ben said he has a medical emergency and then he has to leave.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, his daughter or something. Gosh.
Maybe I'll go get myself a slice of pizza. There's a pizza over here. I'll be right back.
Is the volume all the way up on the? Is the volume all the way up?
When I skip the laptop, yes. So I don't think it works in the room. I don't think it works. No, it doesn't support the volume. So, I don't think it can. Wouldn't. Maybe.
Can someone on the call talk?
Hey,
That's louder. Thank you.
there is,
Yeah, we're just checking the volume.
okay. So Mathy, you are at NYU now? No, K11. Okay, where are you now?
Right now, I'm well. My position currently is at KU11, so I just started there as an assistant professor.
Okay, so then you did your PhD at NYU.
My postdoc. So I did my PhD at KU11, then did a postdoc at NYU, and now I'm back to Belgium.
Which campus of NYU? Because I didn't remember I've seen you there.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to clarify it. It's the Abu Dhabi campus.
I see. Okay. So, yeah, I'm Gada, by the way. I did my PhD at Columbia, but we had tons of work with NYU for this case. Like, I know most of the people there.
Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. I'm organizing my own screen now. All right. But yeah, so this work was done while I was at NYU, but it now also has the logo of Leuven because yeah, I'm there now.
Okay, so guess we can wait a bit for people to potentially join up a bit late, if that's okay with you, Mathy?
Yeah, sure, that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things like that. Yeah. Websites and works. Typically, that one, like, hey. How are you?
Fine, are you?
I'm good.
Those pizzas, if you want.
Uh,
Oh, yeah.
but I might take some of those leftovers.
There will absolutely be buffers. I promise you about it. So, even with
So if I'm right, I'm also being projected in a conference room somewhere, I assume.
We are projected over here, and we see
Okay.
and we see your screen. Yeah, I think it's fine. I wonder what there is. I guess maybe if I use the application, I could do it full screen. I wonder. Full screen, could it? Let's see. No, that's not what I wanted. Fine. It's okay. This is search. Okay, I think maybe we should begin. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so I'm happy to welcome here to have Mathy, who has agreed kindly to give this remote talk about. I think it's a very interesting subject of FragAttacks, breaking Wi-Fi through frame aggregation and fragmentation. And Mathy, please begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending the talk. So I'm Mathy Vanhoef. I just recently started as an assistant professor at KU Leuven in Belgium. And before that, I did a postdoc at New York University on their campus at Abu Dhabi, and I got my PhD at KU Leuven University as well. So today I'll be talking about some one of my latest Wi-Fi research. You may have heard about it already. And if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to simply interrupt me. I like it if things are interactive. You can either type something in the chat. I have it open as well, and hopefully we'll be able to see it, or you can just interrupt me directly. So with that, let's start with the talk. And I first want to give a quick background on Wi-Fi security. And if we look at the history of Wi-Fi security, we see that initially we had web, which was basically absolutely horrible. It was already broken. You could easily get the password of the network. Quickly after that, we got Wi-Fi protected access, so WPA and WPA2. Unfortunately, these two protocols were vulnerable to offline dictionary attacks. Later on, they were also shown vulnerable to key reinstallation attacks and the follow-up of the key reinstallation attack, the Kraken attack as well. However, even though we had this key reinstallation attack, now it's, well, in 2020, so it's still 1 year ago, the crack defenses were actually proven secure. So even if you were using WPA2, things seem to be okay, except you had these offline dictionary attacks. And to prevent those offline dictionary attacks, the Wi-Fi Alliance introduced WPA3. And in WPA3, they added a new handshake to prevent these dictionary attacks. Now, unfortunately, quickly after WPA3 was released, we did discover some side channels in the way that the passphrase was handled, which still allowed an adversary to recover to still do a dictionary attack. But fortunately, WPA3 standard has meanwhile been updated to defend against these side channel leaks. And one thing I want to highlight is that if we look at WPA 1, 2, and 3, they're actually quite similar once the user has connected. So the encryption that is used to protect data frames is practically identical between WPA 2 and 3. And that also means that the attacks that I'm going to discuss today will be applicable against both WPA2 and WPA3. And I also want to mention that lately 2 extra Wi-Fi defenses were standardized as well, which is operating channel validation and beacon protection. These are not yet deployed in practice. They are now part of the Wi-Fi standard. But yeah, in practice, they're not deployed, so they will have no impact on our attacks. But in case they would have been adopted, they would make our attacks harder, but they would still be possible. So if you look back at this, we actually see that lately there's been quite some advancements in Wi-Fi security. I mean, we have WK3, we have here beacon protection and operating channel validation. The Wi-Fi Alliance is now reacting quite well towards security issues. Unfortunately, despite all this progress, we discovered some major, we discovered new flaws that are still applicable to both WPA2 and WPA3 as well. And these fall in 2 broad categories. So on one hand, we discovered some design flaws, and we also discovered related implementation flaws. And I'll first focus on the design flaws, and in particular on what I call the aggregation attack. Now, to explain this attack, I first need to briefly cover how frames are aggregated in Wi-Fi. And yeah, the basic idea here is fairly simple. If you send multiple small packets over Wi-Fi, that causes a lot of overhead because they need to be individually acknowledged. They all have their own header. There needs to be some space between packets. So if you have small packets, it's much better to combine them all into one physical layer packet. The question is then, okay, how can the receiver recognize whether a frame contains just a single packet or whether it contains multiple packets? The answer is quite simple. We add a flag to the plain text Wi-Fi header that will denote whether this encrypted and authenticated data of the packet, whether this encrypted data contains just a single network packet, or if this flag is true, then that means that this encrypted portion of the packet contains multiple aggregated network packets. And you can see here, these aggregated network packets first start with some metadata, then the length of the first packet, and the metadata of the second packet, the length of the second packet, and so on. Now, what's the problem here? Well, the problem with this design is that this flag here is not authenticated. This means that an adversary can take a legitimate frame here, an encrypted frame, and it can flip the value of this flag. And as a result, the encrypted payload, once it is decrypted, will then be parsed in the wrong manner. Because we'll, for example, be parsing one network packet, and we will be a receiver might try to parse that as if it were an aggregation of network packets. Now, at first sight, it seems that this might be hard to abuse because generally, if you take any arbitrary Wi-Fi packet and you flip the flag from false to true, this metadata has a high chance of being invalid, and the packet would simply be dropped. However, under the right scenario, this can be exploited. And I'll first explain under which scenario this can be abused. So we assume the following scenario. We have a victim client here on the left that is connecting to the access point on the right. And we're assuming that we have an adversary that is able to modify frames that are sent between these devices. Now, this adversary will not be able to break the encryption, but it can block encrypted frames from arriving, or it can try to modify encrypted frames. So you basically have a machine in the middle position here. And what we assume that the victim will do is that we somehow trick the victim, so we social engineer the victim into connecting to the server of the adversary. So for instance, we're now tricking the client to set up a connection with the server of the adversary. And how can this be done in practice? Well, we can send an email that embeds an image that is hosted on our website, or we can send a WhatsApp message to our victim. And generally, these messaging applications will show a preview of the website that someone sent. And to get this preview, the client will then create a connection with this website. And if this website belongs to the adversary, that means that the client device will essentially establish a connection with the server of the adversary. Now, what do we do with this connection? In this case, this TCP/IP connection. Well, the adversary will send a special IPv4 packet over this connection to the victim. And here, the router, well, eventually this IPv4 packet will be received by the legitimate access point of the network. The legitimate access point will recognize, oh, this IPv4 packet belongs to this connection of the client. So the access point will try to send it. Well, the access point will encrypt it at the Wi-Fi layer. And then it will send this frame to the victim. Now, before this frame arrives at the victim, the adversary will block the frame from arriving. It will change this is aggregated flag in the header, and then it will forward this modified frame to the victim. And just to clarify here, our machine in the middle here is not able to modify the encrypted content of the Wi-Fi frame. So the encrypted content is this IPv4 packet. But the man in the middle, the machine in the middle here cannot change that. It can only flip this unauthenticated flag. But by constructing this IPv4 packet in a very particular way, this will actually allow us to inject arbitrary packets towards the client. And that's normally not possible because recall that the client is setting up a TCP connection with the server of the adversary, meaning that in a normal situation, the attacker can only send TCP data over that connection. However, by exploiting this flaw in Wi-Fi, we can now inject arbitrary packets, meaning we can also inject ARP packets, we can inject DCP packets, we can also inject ICMP v6 router advertisements to, for example, trick the client into using a malicious DNS server. Now, as you can see here, this attack is not really trivial to perform in practice because on one hand, we need to social engineer the victim into connecting to the server of the adversary, and we need to be within radio range of the victim as well. On the other hand, if we compare this attack to well-known attacks against SSL and TLS, like the Beast and Heist attack against TLS, then this attack is actually a bit easier from the perspective that in our attack here, we do not need to execute malicious JavaScript code on the victim. While for these advanced and well-known attacks against TLS, those attacks required that the adversary is able to trick the user into executing malicious JavaScript code. So my takeaway message here is that although this attack looks complicated, some of these conditions, some of these preconditions are a bit easier than the ones to well-known attacks against TLS. Another important remark here is that by relying on implementation flaws of some home routers, so some home routers have a bug, and this allows us to perform the attack without social engineering. And just a high-level explanation here is that instead of having to trick the victim to set up connection with the server of the adversary, against these vulnerable home routers, we can simply inject a special handshake frame, and that will be forwarded by the vulnerable router as an encrypted Wi-Fi frame to the victim. And basically, instead of having to send a special IPv4 packet, we can now carry out the attack by sending a special handshake frame. And this bug was present in 2 out of 4 home routers that we tested. And in that case, you would be able to perform this attack without user interaction. In other words, if you have a network where you have such a vulnerable router, then you can inject arbitrary packets into the protected Wi-Fi network by simply being within range of the victim. Now, if there are any questions at this point, feel free to interrupt me and to ask directly, or you can type your question into chat as well. If not, I'm going to now show a nice demo that we made that shows the attack against the macOS device. Yes,
Mathy?
go ahead.
Maybe you can just explain about the ICMP version 6 part of the attack.
Yes. So the impact of the attack is that we're able to inject any network layer packet into the Wi-Fi network of the victim. So we can inject ARP, DHCP, and so on. And as a nice example to illustrate what an adversary can do with this injection capability is that if the victim, well, if the device of the victim supports IPv6, then we can send an ICMP-v6 router advertisement. And this is, well, I may be simplifying a little bit, but this is in a sense the replacement of DHCP in IPv6 networks. So the router advertisement will basically contain the IP range that is used in the local network. And more importantly, this router advertisement can also advertise the DNS server that clients can use. So basically, if a device supports IPv6, and we can inject an ICMP-v6 packet, which basically tells the client, hey, these are the IP ranges in this local network, and this is the DNS server that you can use. And combined with some other minor tricks, we can then force the victim to use this DNS server. So I hope that clarifies the question a little bit.
Yes, excellent. There was also a question on the chat, if you may want to answer.
Yes. So I see the question, can you explain how the attack is related to the aggregated flag? So, well, let's explain it as follows. If there wouldn't be this vulnerability here at the Wi-Fi layer that we are able to flip this flag, then we would not be able to inject ICMP-v6 messages, for example. Why is that? Well, because here the victim is establishing a TCP connection. And by default, we can only send TCP data over that connection. But by sending a specially crafted IPv4 packet, and in combination with that flipping this flag here, we can then inject arbitrary packets and not just not just TCP data. So here it's absolutely essential that the adversary is able to change this flag, and yeah, this flag is not authenticated, meaning the receiver won't notice that this flag got changed. And if I'm right, I'll explain in a bit more detail in a slide later how exactly this IPv4 packet is constructed, and that should also further clarify that question. Okay. So I'll now show a demo. During the demo, feel free to type in more questions or think about them. So in the demo here, I'm going to attack a macOS device, and it's, as you can see, connected to a protected Wi-Fi network. And let's say I'm visiting a website that is by default not using HTTPS, which fortunately the NYU website is an example of. Now the login website does use HTTPS, but yeah, if you just type NYU, it doesn't. And here I'm basically now initializing the attack. So this is my server that will be listening for incoming TCP connections, setting up my malicious DNS server, and yeah, I'm also capturing some traffic, so we'll be able to see what happens. This is the Wi-Fi attacker. So this is the machine in the middle, and here I'm basically saying we're going to target this macOS device. And the first thing that our tool will do is it will basically establish this machine in the middle position. Now you don't need to know exactly how this works at the Wi-Fi level, just accept that we are now able to block encrypted packets and try to modify them. So now is the social engineering aspect. I send an email to the victim, and this email unfortunately includes an image that, as you can see, is hosted on the server of the adversary. And that means the client automatically connected to my server, as you can see here, to the server of the attacker. And here we're constructing a special IPv4 packet that, as you can see, contains this ICMP v6 packet that we want to inject. And we detect this packet now at the Wi-Fi attacker as well. We flip this aggregated flag, which is also called the AMSDU flag. And yeah, we're exploiting the vulnerability here. And as a result, the victim will now use our malicious DNS server. And here you can see this is the malicious packet that we managed to inject. And here I'm basically telling the victim, hey, start using my DNS server now. And as a result, when the victim now visits the website of NYU, it's in fact seeing a malicious copy. Now, as a user, you don't immediately notice this. There is a warning here that it's not secure, but yeah, we're assuming that the victim ignores this. So if the victim now logs in, it's actually sending the data to our server. Because again, yeah, we're using a malicious DNS server. This malicious DNS server redirected to a malicious copy of the website, and you can then intercept what the victim is doing. So I hope you enjoyed that demo. And unfortunately, we found that nearly all major operating systems are affected. And that's because this aggregation functionality is basically a requirement of the 11n standard. So it's only some rare devices, in practice only NetBSD and some IoT devices are not affected because they don't support frame aggregation. Now there's one part I have not covered yet, and that is how this special IPv4 packet is constructed. And basically the way we construct a special IPv4 packet is in the following way. So we first give this a normal IPv4 header. We then give it a special value for the IP identification field. And then for the TCP header itself, we need to use the correct port, and we also need to use the correct IP address. So we have no control in practice over the remaining fields. And finally, in the TCP data, we're going to put the frame that we want to inject to the victim. So here in the data field, in practice, for example, we will have this ICMP v6 router advertisement. And this is the IPv4 packet that our malicious server will send to the victim. And once this IPv4 packet reaches the legitimate access point, then the access point will encrypt it at the Wi-Fi layer. And the way this works is that the Wi-Fi layer will first add this RFC 1042 header. Details of that are not important, but that's what happens behind the scene. We'll not set the aggregated flag because we're assuming that this IPv4 packet is transported in a normal Wi-Fi frame. But before this Wi-Fi frame now arrives at the victim, and recall here that all this data shown here is encrypted at the Wi-Fi layer, so we cannot, our Wi-Fi attacker cannot modify this. But the Wi-Fi attacker can flip this flag, so it will flip the flag from false to true. And as a result, the victim will now think that this is an aggregated frame. In particular, the victim will think that these first bytes represent the metadata of the first packet. But this metadata will be invalid, so it will ignore the first packet. But this is through luck. The length of this first packet now corresponds exactly to the value of the IP identification field. And we have full control over the values we can put here. We can put any value we want there. In particular, we can put a value here so that the second packet will start exactly at the start of the TCP data. So this means that the second packet now corresponds to data that we fully control as an adversary. Or to summarize that, if we control the IP identification fields and if we can control part of the TCP data, we can use this flaw to inject arbitrary packets towards the adversary. So if there are questions, feel free to ask. I'll see your first question in chat. So the question is, so the metadata and length that is ignored is not authenticated. So actually, at the Wi-Fi layer, the bytes that are all sent here, they are authenticated. In other words, so we have our attacker here has and in a sense we have two instances. We have on one hand we have the server of the attacker, right? And the server of the attacker can control the IP identification field on the TCP data. But the attacker cannot control these other fields because then the IPv4 packet wouldn't arrive at the adversary. But at the Wi-Fi layer, this whole packet is, all these bytes that I'm highlighting here are encrypted unauthenticated, meaning the Wi-Fi attacker cannot modify those. The only thing the Wi-Fi attacker can do is flip this flag. And because we constructed the packet now in this special way, does the attack work. So in a sense, here the metadata is authenticated, but what is not authenticated is the flag.
Mathy?
Yes.
Can you explain about the metadata? I mean, what's the length of the metadata field? And right, I mean, how does it work really? What is the metadata there? Because it looks like you can't control the first metadata. Of course, you can completely control the second one, but it looks to me like you cannot completely control the first one. Actually, very limited control over the first one. So I guess it's really very important. What are the rules for the metadata, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, the metadata here is actually very simple. It represents the MAC address of the sender on the receiver of the Wi-Fi frame here. And the way most receivers work is that if they notice that the metadata has a MAC address that doesn't correspond to a valid or to a known sender or receiver, then the packet is just ignored. So in other words, if the metadata isn't valid, then it's just that sub packet that is ignored, but it will continue processing the next sub packet.
So the length of the metadata is fixed.
Yes. The length of the metadata is indeed fixed. It's always, I think, 6 plus 6 bytes, so 12 bytes.
Right. So that's how you actually get to the exact length for the first packet which you want to get rid of, right? Because the length of the metadata is fixed, and then you just have the length, and right?
Yes, yeah, indeed. So we know exactly how long this will be. As an adversary, we can then control this field. So this field is always 2 bytes. And this length field represents the length of the first sub packet. So basically, as long as we can control the IP identification field, we know exactly where the second sub packet will start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and right. And of course you control the IP identification field as an attacker.
Yeah, which in fact is a huge coincidence, because if this wouldn't align this nicely, say that part of this length would have aligned here with the length of the IPv4 packet, or with some metadata of the TCP, like the TCP port, then this attack wouldn't be possible. So we're very lucky that the length here corresponds to the IP identification field, which we can freely control.
Right, cool. Yeah, really cool and lucky.
Yes. So I see that there's another question in chat. Would this give an adversary that already controls the IP any more power, or would it just provide cover for unsavory behavior? Don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but oh well. So, well, if you already control the access point, you in a sense already have full control over the network. So from that perspective, you don't gain much from this. But I guess you could use it as a cover to pretend that no, it's actually someone else attacking you. But yeah, in a sense, if you control the access point, you already control the network.
I would doubt that somebody controlling the access point would try to use that as an excuse. Oh, I didn't attack, but you were attacked by this complex attack. I think this will be the most incriminating defense anybody could imagine, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking like in an enterprise, right? Like it could be one bad actor doing this instead of manipulating like a specific access point, right? If there was like a targeted attack, right?
Yeah.
So like I'm trying to think of like when would this be used?
Oh, this could be used for, okay, so why don't we, I let Mathy answer that. That's a simple, great question. Mathy, instead of me answering, I would let you answer. You know, can you give some examples of potential scenarios where this could be deployed?
Yeah. So I think that corresponds to listing the preconditions of the attack. So on one hand, I don't think this will ever be abused in, say, a mass attack. It's only something that you can use in targeted attacks. But let's say that, yeah, your target is really valuable and you're able to make them visit malicious websites, so you're able to get them to connect to your server. And if you are within radio range, then you can perform this attack. So yeah, as long as those two conditions are met, that you can basically social engineer the victim up to some point and are within radio range, then I think the best example is the demo website. So if you are able to send an email to me and are within radio range of me, then you can intercept my NYU password if I'm not paying attention.
But yeah, I think that the question of the radio is important. You didn't really discuss it. I mean, what are the requirements? Because you do need to change packets here to hold packets, so you do need to interfere with the radio signal, right? So that is not just intercepting it. You do need to manipulate it. So can you elaborate on what? How feasible it is? What is the requirement for the attacker to be able to do it?
Yeah, so I think this corresponds to the question here. So if I'm right, you want to know how hard or how difficult it is for the adversary here to establish this machine in the middle position. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah. What are the conditions that the attacker can actually do this? Man in the middle here is that it needs to intercept the signal from the access point and then to manipulate it, and not in, so that the victim actually still receives it and so on. That is a non-trivial radio interference issue, right?
Yes, indeed. So the way that this is being done is, so let me first and for all say that if you're within normal range of a Wi-Fi network, then that's possible to do. And how is this done exactly? Well, what the adversary does is it will pretend that it will basically clone the network on a different channel. So let's say that the legitimate access point is on channel 1. Adversary will clone the network, meaning it will just duplicate all the frames on a different channel, say channel 6. And then there's fairly simple techniques to force the victim to then connect to channel 6, to the channel with the malicious copy of the network. And yeah, what then happens is that the legitimate access points sends frames on channel 1. The adversary receives these, forwards them over channel 6, and the same way in reverse. So that's the trick here. The trick is that we put the victim and the legitimate network on a different channel. And then it becomes very easy to, yeah.
And don't you need your signal to be stronger than the access point for that?
Interestingly, no, because we can send what's called a channel switch announcement to the client to simply say to the client, hey, I'm now on a different channel. Please switch channels.
That's really cool, because when we are doing this kind of wireless interception experiments, we're using this Hack5. They have these kind of devices for this hacking, and they do require to have a stronger signal. So I guess they're not using this methodology. It sounds like it's not a very complicated. I would love if you, okay, maybe later I'll ask you, get more information about this specific part of the attack. Sounds very useful, very nice.
Yeah. So I can provide some extra information after the talk as well.
Thank you. You want to ask from here? You want to come here, Reynaldo, so we can hear you. Just a moment, there was a question here. Come closer.
So I think it might be a follow-up to Dr. Amir's question. Can the victim see? So, if you're trying to operate on a separate channel, would the victim be able to see both or just one? And I think I understand Amir's question. If it needs to be stronger, because I think it only pick up one if it's from the same access point. I'm not sure if it'll look at from the user's perspective, they won't see two separate channels, right?
So once the victim here switched to the other channel, so to the malicious channel, it will only see one access point in a sense, because if you're on channel 6, you cannot see anything of channel 1.
And what Mathy explained is that you do not have to be stronger. There is some tricks that you change the channel. You said you don't have to be stronger in order to do that. So that's not the usual technique that I'm familiar with, that requires you to be stronger to impersonate the Wi-Fi. So
maybe I think there's a preference in channels actually.
I think he said that you can spoof some message that tells the client to switch channel, right? That's essentially what you said.
Yeah, I think
that's really cool. Okay.
Yeah, indeed. Because basically with these old Wi-Fi attacks that are really against open networks mainly. So this is mainly a technique to perform older Wi-Fi attacks, I would say. Then it used to be, okay, set up an access point with a much stronger signal, and then the victim will prefer that stronger signal. And if you want, you can do the same thing here. It would still work as well by sending a stronger signal on a different channel. Then I think most clients will prefer the channel with a stronger signal. But yeah, there's an easier way to make a client change channels, which is basically you can just spoof a frame that says, hey, I'm the access point. I'm now switching to a different channel. And that frame does not have authentication, so you can just spoof it even against encrypted networks.
That's a nice trick.
Okay. So there was one more question in the chat. So all sub-packets are authenticated together as one packet, not individually. Yeah, exactly. All these sub-packets are authenticated together. Now let's continue. So that covers the aggregation attack. The second design flaw is the mixed key attack. And here I again need to give some background on how Wi-Fi works. And in a sense, if we want to send very large frames over Wi-Fi, we have a bit of the opposite problem as before, in a sense that if this large packet now gets corrupted along the way, we would have to retransmit this whole large packet, which is inefficient. And especially if there's a lot of background noise, it's actually more efficient to split this large fragment, this large frame into multiple smaller fragments. So that if, say, fragment 2 is lost, we only need to retransmit fragment 2. Now this is all nice and well. Now the question becomes, how can we securely reassemble these fragments? So one thing to clarify here is that each fragment here is authenticated individually. And then the question is, how do you securely reassemble these separately authenticated fragments? Well, let me first and for all explain how this reassembly process happens in an open network. And if we want to reassemble plain text fragments, then first and for all, we need to add some kind of sequence number to basically denote that all these fragments belong to the same original packet. On this original packet, or well, this original frame is here denoted by S. Now we also need to know the order of these fragments. So every frame also needs to have fragment number, and we need to know what the last fragment is. So we need another flag to indicate once we have received the last fragment in the sequence. And in an open Wi-Fi network without encryption, this is sufficient to reliably reassemble fragments back to the original frame. In an encrypted network, every fragment also has a so-called packet number on top of the sequence number. And that's just the way Wi-Fi was designed. So you have both the sequence number that is the same for every fragment of a packet. And then next to that, you have a packet number which acts as a nonce and as a replay counter. And with this information, we now have, well, in an encrypted network, all these fields here are authenticated, meaning an adversary cannot change the fragment number, so it cannot internally reorder fragments. It cannot change this flag here to indicate what is the last fragment. Most parts of the header are also authenticated. So at first sight, this actually looks secure, because based on this here, I cannot reorder fragments. I cannot mix fragments of different frames. This all seems good. And yeah, of course, here this replay counter, if you see a replay counter again, you will drop that packet. So also that's actually important clarification here. These packet numbers here, so n plus 1, n plus 2, they need to be consecutive. Mm-hmm. So what's not allowed is that fragment 1 has packet number n, and then fragment number 2 has, say, packet number n plus 6. That's not allowed. This needs to increment by exactly 1, or the reassembly process is aborted. So yeah, at first sight, this seems okay. Unfortunately, if we combine this feature with session key renewal, then things go wrong. And yeah, key renewal is basically a feature of Wi-Fi networks that the handshake can be executed again every hour, or sometimes the key is also updated when you roam from one access point to another. The thing is, during this rekey, on one hand, yeah, you're negotiating a new session key, but the packet numbers also will restart from 0. Mm. And it turns out that this is something that we can abuse to mix the fragments that were encrypted under different keys. Now, let me just illustrate this at a high level. So I'm not going to discuss all the technical details of the attack, because those really are quite technical. So let's just look at a high level. We assume that we have a client here that is connected to the access point, and we are using this multi-channel machine in the middle position. And yeah, at one point we assume that the victim here will send a large Wi-Fi frame. We're assuming that this frame is split into 2 Wi-Fi fragments. So fragment 0 and fragment 1. Both these fragments are encrypted using the key K. And here what we do, as an adversary, we are blocking the second fragment from arriving, and we're only forwarding the first fragment. Then we assume that at some point the network will update the session key from, in this case, K to M. And as I mentioned, when we update, well, when this rekey happens, the packet numbers will also restart back from 0. Because the keys changed anyway, so right, why not just reset the packet numbers to 0 as well? Well, the problem now is that at some point the victim will again send a fragmented frame. And in this case, it's encrypted under key M. We're now blocking the first fragment from arriving, or only forwarding the second fragment. And if we very carefully time this attack, then in this case, the access point will reassemble these two fragments together, while these two fragments actually belong to different original frames. And that's because, for example, this fragment here might have had a replay counter of value n, but yeah, this got reset back to 0 here during the rekey. And if we time it very correctly, then fragment 1 here may have a replay counter value of n+1, which means here the access point will try to reassemble these two fragments. It will see, okay, this has replay counter n, this has n+1, that all looks good. And it doesn't notice that these two fragments were actually protected using different keys. So this is a bit of a, in practice, this attack is very hard to execute, but in theory, it's possible. And the impact is that you can mix the fragments of different frames, and in practice, you can abuse this to try to exfiltrate data that someone is sending. As I mentioned, so one quick thing I want to say, and then please interrupt me.
Mathy,
Yes.
So about applications of this attack, right? So I assume you did, of course, experiment with this attack. You did implement it, right? But about application of this attack, so shouldn't you be able, for example, to do DNS poisoning with this attack?
Unfortunately not, because, well, that's going to be very hard. So as far as I know, that's not possible.
Interesting. Okay.
Because we can only take existing frames that are sent over the Wi-Fi network, and then somehow split them and mix them together in a unexpected way.
Yeah, what you would do is you would have two DNS queries, right? One going to the victim server that you're trying to poison the response, one going to your own server, and then you can control the second part of your own packet to put the poisoning, and you're piggybacking on the first part from the response from the legitimate server. You're using all the DNS data from there. So I think that this should work, but it's definitely tricky. It's very similar to we have done this kind of poisoning attacks against DNS, but that was using IP fragmentation, which is kind of a bit similar to what you're doing here, right? So it actually links the fragmentation attacks of IP layer, and here that you're doing fragmentation attacks in the Wi-Fi layer. So that's kind of nice to have the two fragmentation attacks linked together. But yes, it's not trivial, definitely. And particularly this UDP stuff, UDP checksum to handle. I wonder if you tried even to get around the UDP checksum. It's not trivial, but at least in the IP, it was definitely doable.
Yeah. So I was indeed also thinking about the checksum. That's one hard aspect. Yeah, I think I've read some of the DNS fragmentation papers. What just came into my mind right now is that what might be possible is that, but that again won't be easy. Maybe you're able to exfiltrate the port that is used for DNS requests and are then able to spoof a reply
Yeah, that's what.
That might be possible.
I mean, you don't know which port the request came from, of course. That's when source port randomization, but you don't need to know it because this is in the first fragment anyway, right? So you just need to fix the UDP checksum, but it is possible to fix the UDP checksum because you know exactly the boundary, and all you need to know is you need to know what is exactly the second fragment, the legitimate one, the one you're trying to spoof. And normally you would know it because it's constant. So you could compute the difference that you need to introduce into the UDP, and that's how we fix the UDP checksum. So yeah, so this is well, that part is definitely doable. We've done it, right? But yeah, so of course there are some nice challenges here, but then you could use this attack to exactly do the DNS poisoning. Yeah, okay. Right. We have this nice collection of different ways to do DNS poisoning. It would be nice to have one more, But yeah.
Yeah, so I think at first sight it might indeed be possible. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is a very tricky attack at the Wi-Fi level, but if you can indeed reuse the first fragment of the legitimate DNS and then yeah, you still need to social engineer the victim to connect to your server so you can send this second part of the DNS message somehow. But yeah, if you get all the right conditions, I think, I would say so. Yeah, possibly. Okay, are there any other questions or remarks up to this point? So not yet. So to basically summarize this attack, so we're able to mix the content of two frames. And yeah, in the paper, to give a practical example, I exploited this to exfiltrate some data. And this attack is then possible if a device sends fragmented frames, which in practice seems rare unless Wi-Fi 6 is used. You have to social engineer the victim to connect to the server of the attacker so that we control the content of at least one of the packets. And the network has to periodically refresh the session key, which basically means that fulfilling all these requirements at the same time is pretty hard. There is one very important remark. There's an extremely common implementation flaw that means that we don't need to rely on the network refreshing the session key. And this implementation flaw is basically that a receiver will not check whether these replay counters are consecutive. And yeah, here I'm showing an example how data can be exfiltrated. So here we basically assume that we have our first frame that is sent to the adversary. So we social engineer the victim to get an image from our server. Then we have a frame here sent over plain text HTTP that contains some login information. And then it's possible, to mix the content of these two frames, which basically would mean that the login data would be sent to the attacker. The interesting part about this attack, which may be good to highlight, is that here it doesn't really matter what the resulting TCP checksum is, because the TCP checksum is only checked by the adversary. And in this case, we are the adversary, so we don't care about the checksum. This data will arrive at our server, and by then we know the information. If the checksum is wrong, it will be forwarded over the internet.
I think I missed it, but how do you manage to get the attacker in the middle here from the start? It seems so. Like this. So like okay, from the start, we're able to know the sequence of the fragments. We're able to block the second one, and then in the second time, we're able to block the first one, and then we're able to insert data for exfiltration. I'm not sure how that's possible. And I mean, so like, I think I'm missing some assumptions here.
Yeah, here I also just focused on the core level, the core aspects of the attack. So what I didn't explain is that here the adversary will establish this multi-channel machine in the middle position, exactly like in the previous attack. So here we can again clone the access point on a different channel, trick the victim to connect to this different channel, and then forward frames between the channel. So that's how we're able to reliably block these frames on surround.
Okay. All right. Yes.
And is sent in plain text, so that is very easy to derive. The packet number is also sent in plain text, so we also know that exactly. The rekey can also be easily detected as well. What is very hard in this attack is that at some point we need to social engineer the victim into sending a frame that we partially control, and timing when this frame is sent, so in this case timing exactly when here this second frame is sent is non-trivial. That's the hard part in practice.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, if you just assume the victim, for example, visits the website of the attacker, then this part becomes easy. And that's a pretty common assumption, pretty common scenario even.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, if we assume JavaScript code on the victim, we can set up some kind of communication, and then it's easier.
Yeah.
So it's definitely possible, just tricky in practice. Okay, so I hope that this part is clear. So the high-level takeaway here really is that a receiver is not checking whether fragments were, in this case, protected using the same key. That's the core of the issue here. Okay. So we now come to the third design flaw, which I call the fragment cache attack. And I'm again going to give a high-level explanation here. And the problem is that fragments are not removed from memory after the client disconnected. On this case, this can be exploited against what I call an authenticated hotspot, which is, for example, eduroam. And with eduroam, it could also be that a malicious person is connecting to your network as well. For instance, if I would visit your university, maybe you don't trust me, but I can connect to exactly the same access point that you are using. So I can use my own personal credentials to connect to the access point. I can even spoof your MAC address because that's public information anyway. And I can then send an encrypted fragment to this access point. And I, of course, encrypt it using my own keys. So the access point will decrypt this fragment, and it will store the plain text version of this fragment in memory. And because I spoofed your MAC address, it will also be storing this fragment as if it came from your MAC address. And then if I, as an adversary, now disconnect, this decrypted fragment will stay in the memory of the access point. It's not cleared. And if the legitimate client then connects, then what we can do is that when the victim now at some point will send a fragmented frame, we can trick the access point into reassembling the second fragment with this malicious first fragment. So the idea here is that, yeah, we can basically inject an arbitrary fragment into the fragment cache of the access point, and then carefully manipulate the situation so that this injected fragment will at some point be reassembled with a second fragment of the victim. And we can then again abuse that to exfiltrate data.
But they have to have the same sequence numbers, no? Don't you need to predict the sequence numbers that the client will use?
Yes and no. So we indeed need to know the sequence number. What an attacker can do, see if that's actually possible. Well, sequence numbers on one hand are incremental, so we can do that. And we would also be able to inject multiple fragments under different sequence numbers. I think the sequence number is 12 bits long. So in practice, okay, you have to be a bit careful, but it's doable to predict it. No, actually, I just remembered. We don't have to predict the sequence number because that's not authenticated. So let's say I'm injecting this fragment here under sequence number S. If the client then uses a different sequence number, then, oh well, I just overwrite that sequence number to the value S. And yeah, the sequence number is not authenticated, meaning the receiver won't notice that we changed it. It's only the packet number that is authenticated, but not the sequence number.
Okay.
So maybe it's good to do a quick recap on fragmentation here. So basically all fragments of the same frame have the same sequence number S, and all these fragments need to have an incremental packet number. And interestingly, all this data here is authenticated except the sequence number. So we can very easily change it.
That's not good. I mean, you can actually ask me a question.
Yeah.
Just the screen here.
Okay. So about the cache flaw, is there does the cache I guess there's a temporal importance to this, right? You need to do this before the cache item before it gets removed from the cache. Do you have any idea on the constraints that are needed for this attack related to the cache specifically?
Yes, so it's indeed important that this malicious fragment here is not cleared from memory. And what I found in practice is that...
Mathy, are
Okay,
you
I'm assuming you can hear me.
Why don't you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I don't think we hear. No, I can just disconnect from here, I guess. What did we do? Mathy, can you say something?
Hello?
We lost volume at all. What's going on? Oh, I see what happened. No, it's you. One of us must have. That's okay. I think we should be okay. Yeah, we should be okay now. One of us must have pressed the mute button here. I think so.
Can you hear me?
You mean here?
Testing.
No, we do hear now. It's just only local. I don't know why.
Speaker should be HDMI.
Where is this speaker? HDMI. It's not. Probably is HDMI already. I don't know if you're hearing or not.
So I still hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
Is it working?
Yeah, it's working. It's working. We just, because I was moving the laptop away for Ronaldo to ask the question, so it got disconnected from the HDMI. Now we are all okay. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm not sure, but I think I'm actually going way over time. So
Okay.
feel free to interrupt me and say that you have been there long enough. Otherwise, I will continue. So that's up to you. Let me at least, I'll try to go over the other slides a bit faster. Wait, let me recap the question. So the question was about the timing of the fragment cache. And we indeed need to be fast enough to finish the attack in general. For instance, against an access point that is based on Linux, this fragment will stay in memory for just 2 seconds, which means we have to be fast, but it's still doable, just a bit more complicated. And against a lot of routers, we actually found that there's no timeout at all. No. So in practice, yeah, you have a lot of time to perform the attack because this stays in memory almost indefinitely. Okay, so to summarize the impact of this third design flaw, we can abuse this to exfiltrate data, or under the right circumstances also to inject packets. In this case, this attack works against what I call a hotspot-like network where people distrust each other. And a very nice example is eduroam. And the second condition is that the client must also send fragmented frames, which seems to be uncommon currently, but will likely become a lot more common once Wi-Fi 6 is more popular. Now, what's very interesting here is that in principle, the very old web protocol is also affected by this attack. And web is even affected by the mixed key design flaw as well. Now, web is horribly broken for a lot of other reasons as well. But this does show that, in a sense, the real underlying cause of these flaws have been part of Wi-Fi since a long time. Now, for the next part, I want to discuss a bit of the implementation flaws as well. So apart from these design flaws, we also discovered some implementation flaws. And some of these are surprisingly easy. In particular, sometimes plain text frames are accepted by constructing them in a special way. So if we, for example, send a plain text fragmented frame, that's accepted by a receiver, or if it has a broadcast destination address, it's accepted. Or if we send plain text frames while the client is still connected, then some vulnerable device is accepted as well. And yeah, this was surprisingly common. For example, Apple and some Android devices were vulnerable. Some Windows network cards were vulnerable. Certain home and professional access points were vulnerable, and so on. And yeah, in this case, you can trivially inject frames if a device is vulnerable like that. There's a very nice demo here. We here have a power plug, a smart power plug, which you can manually turn on and off. But if you're vulnerable to this kind of attack, and because this power plug doesn't use any extra protection, anyone close to your Wi-Fi network can just remotely turn it on and off. And yeah, in a sense, it's not surprising that these IoT devices have these kinds of vulnerabilities, right? I mean, it's basically what we assume all the time. But what is interesting here is that, in a sense, Wi-Fi is the last line of defense, because a lot of times to exploit these IoT devices, you at least need some kind of foothold into the network of the victim. But now using these Wi-Fi attacks, we have exactly that. We have access to some form of access to the victim network, meaning we can now exploit vulnerable devices in the network under the right conditions. Now let's go to another implementation flaw. The other one that I want to discuss now is the mixed fragments implementation flaw. And this is basically related to something that I said before. Oh no, actually, it's not related. It's a completely different implementation flaw. But what we found is that some devices only require that the first fragment is encrypted and all the next fragments can be sent in plain text. This is, for example, the case against practically all Windows on Linux devices. And with this implementation vulnerability, some of these design flaws become easier to abuse. Now, against certain implementations, we also have the opposite situation, where the first fragments can all be sent in plain text, as long as the last fragment is encrypted. And then it's actually trivial to inject data into the network as long as some device sends fragmented frames, because we can basically put the packet that we want to inject into the first plaintext fragments and then just append any encrypted fragment, and that will cause the injection of our packet. I think this is now the last implementation flaw that I want to highlight. And this is that a lot of implementations don't check whether these packet numbers here are actually consecutive. In fact, it's so bad in practice that nobody checks this except Linux. So the only implementation that we found that checks for this condition is Linux, and even Linux didn't used to check this all the time. It was only in an update about 2 or 3 years ago that Linux started checking this. And with this implementation flaws, yeah, it becomes much easier to do this mixed key attack. Actually, it's not yet the last implementation flaw that I want to discuss. There is one more. And that's actually very interesting, because we have now been discussing flaws that abuse aggregation and fragmentation. And you would think that, okay, let's say a device doesn't support fragmentation and it doesn't support aggregation, then you might think, then surely at least there is one device that is secure. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because these devices that don't support fragmentation, they will treat every individual fragment as if it were a full frame. And combined with some, under the right conditions, that can be abused to inject frames. Basically, if you're able to send a packet to the victim where you control, say, the end of the frame, that would mean that, okay, the first fragment contains data you wouldn't control, but then the second fragment would be fully under your control. And then against a vulnerable device like this, you would be able to inject arbitrary packets by including the packet that you want in the second part of the frame. That second part will then be sent in the second fragment. And the vulnerable implementation will treat this second fragment as its own individual packet. But what I don't, so my goal here is actually not to highlight the really details of this flaw. The main thing I want to highlight here is that this shows that all devices are vulnerable. at least all the devices we tested are vulnerable. So it could in theory be that there is a secure device, but I haven't found it yet. So yeah, we have a lot of vulnerable devices. We created a tool to test both clients and access points for vulnerabilities. Yeah, you can check out this tool at the following link. You need the password of the network to test devices, so you cannot use this as an attack tool. But it's a very nice framework to perform these attacks. I'm of course a bit biased, but if you ever do Wi-Fi research, I do recommend to check it out because I think it's also can be used as a nice basis to to perform your own Wi-Fi experiments, basically. Okay, do I still have a little bit of time to end, or should we wrap up?
I think we should better wrap up. Because,
Yes,
show
I
people
agree.
rush places and so on. So I think we'll let you conclude, right?
So apologies for the long this long time of the talk. I really enjoyed the interactive discussions, though. For more information, you can visit the following website. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mathy. Thank you. Bye-bye.